Did you know that every fan of science fiction should eat healthy? Today we're gonna talk about diet in science fiction. I was only joking. It was a temporal anomaly since I am from the future. And today we will be dealing with time travel. I will tell you about the emergence of subgenre, its history, I will mention some of the most interesting and well-known stories, and finally, in the spirit of from fiction to science and back, I will tell you about the real ways to travel through time. So sit back, relax, grab a drink and join me on a temporal journey. Remember that moment when you regretted a decision? When you were angry and said something wrong or messed up a job interview out of nerves? Well, who hasn't at least once wanted to turn back time and choose differently? To start braking earlier, to turn faster and avoid a collision, or simply to refrain from saying words that cannot be taken back. In other words, do something different. Wouldn't we, for example, want to go back a week and pull the lotto ticket out of our pocket before we put the pants in the washing machine? Because it just turned out that we probably marked the winning numbers and no one has come forward to claim the prize. Or we simply didn't buy Bitcoin when it cost 20 pence per unit a decade ago. Unfortunately, time relentlessly marches forward and only forward. But why? The laws of physics do not impose a direction. The equations describing spacetime and passage of time work perfectly in both ways, allowing us to mathematically trace the history of the universe backward to a hypothetical beginning, a point called the Big Bang. So, if theoretically there is no difference in which direction time flows, we can wonder, can it flow in the opposite direction? If so, does it have any significance for us? Can we take advantage of this fact, and if so, how? People have been asking themselves these type of questions for millennia. Authors of science fiction have been particularly prolific in this regard, although their colleagues in physics are by no means staying behind with wild ideas. There is even a hypothesis of a mirror universe right now where time runs backwards. Surely every paleontologist would like to see what dinosaurs really looked like, proudly walking through areas covered with gigantic trees and hunting smaller animals. Forget paleontologists, I would love to see it myself, wouldn't you? There's a reason why we all love Flintstones and Jurassic Park, do we? And what about our civilization? What it would look like in 100 years? Will it still exist? Perhaps a historian would love to personally trace the history of ancient states, and an archaeologist would study a culture lost centuries ago, whose traces he's painstakingly uncovering and dusts off with a small brush from the sands of the past. The renowned physicist Stephen Hawking took his reflections and ideas a step further and decided to conduct an experiment. In 2009, he held a champagne party for time travelers, but announced it only after it had already taken place. The fact that no one showed up would at least partially prove that time travel is not possible. But that's a pretty weak argument in my opinion, since it would simply be enough that the travelers just didn't like cheap champagne from our times. Or it could be that they didn't really like the organizer himself. Or maybe simply by going on a journey they branched off the timeline and we are stuck in here with poor Stephen Hawking. Yes, surely that's exactly how it was. However, let's start with the very concept of time travel in fiction before moving on to science. The idea of time travel is so incredibly attractive that it ignites the imagination with the possibilities that it brings with it. What do you think? Who first came up with the concept? If it's the Time Machine novel by Herbert George Wells that comes to your mind, which by the way has existed for just over a century, you're a bit mistaken. The first mentions of time travel appear already in Hindu mythology. The Mahabharata contains the story of King Raivata Kakudmi, who goes to the heavens, meets the creator Brahma, and waits to ask about a prince who would be a worthy partner for his daughter. Brahma laughs that while Raivata was waiting for him to finish listening to the musical performance, centuries have passed on Earth, and all the princes he had considered, as well as their children and grandchildren, were no longer alive. In the ancient Japanese tale Urashima Taro, found in Manyoshu, the oldest written anthology of Japanese poetic texts, a hero named Urashima no Ko, in exchange for saving a sea turtle, is transported on its back to the underwater dragon palace. As a reward, he spends time there with Princess Otohime. He thinks he only spends there few days, but upon returning to his village, he discovers that 300 years have already passed. Time travel also appears in Jewish mythology, in the form of the story about Honi ha-Mgael, who fell asleep for over 70 years, and when he woke up, his family was no longer in the world and no one knew him. A little bit of trivia in here. I'm talking about a real person whose grave can be visited in Israel. There are other early mentions of time travel in literature, but they too are non-technical, supernatural, where the journey again occurs as a result of a long sleep. I can mention here the 2440, A Dream If Ever There Was One, by Louis Sebastian Mercier. There's also Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving, Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy, and When the Sleeper Awakes by Herbert George Wells himself. As a result of the actions of a guardian angel, narrator of the novel Memoirs of the 20th Century by Samuel Madden receives letters from the future. Ebenezer Scrooge, the protagonist of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, has visions of Christmases past and future thanks to the spirits. As we can see, the idea of trips in the future had existed in our history for thousands of years, although it was the time machine novel that mostly contributed to popularization of this idea worldwide. Perhaps for the first time, the protagonist embarked on a journey to the future in a technological, conscious and deliberate manner, rather than through sleep or the action of unknown higher powers. Thus began the full-blooded science fiction concept of time travel in both directions. Traveling several decades forward from Wells' novel, we encounter a surge of time travel stories in pop culture. Particularly generous in this regard are Hollywood film studios and television networks, providing a true abundance of films and series where the basis for time travel is most often the desire to change the past. In the well-known and probably universally loved comedy Back to the Future, Marty McFly wants to save his friend Dr. Emmett from death, and himself as well. So he escapes into the past and writes a letter warning him about a terrorist attack. Of course, during his stay in the past, he almost causes his own erasure, showing us what the grandfather paradox could look like in practice. Of course, the desire to change the past does not always aim to protect humanity, as shown in The Terminator, where during the war with humans, Skynet wants to prevent the birth of John Connor, leader of the resistance movement, and for this purpose he sends a robot into the past to kill his mother. Once again, nothing goes as planned, soldier sends back in time to protect Sarah Connor, falls in love with her during her mission, and the rest you probably know yourself. In the novel Past Watch, The Redemption of Christopher Columbus by Orson Scott Card, we encounter a situation where scientists create a device capable of looking into the past. Wanting to see Christopher Columbus during the alleged vision of the Virgin Mary commanding him to embark on a journey, they discover that the traveler sees a hologram sent from the future. They decide to prevent this and cause an alternative history where American Indians invade Europe. As we can see from the examples above, attempting to change anything in the past can bring unforeseen consequences, all thanks to the working of that damned butterfly effect. This is very well illustrated in the film of the same title, in which the protagonist, through his written diaries, tries to change the past, but in doing so, he creates many versions of the future, in which always something goes wrong. Sometimes a friend becomes a sadist and ends up in a prison. Sometimes the girl he doesn't want to part with leaves, and eventually the protagonist himself loses his hands in an explosion. The further it goes, the worse it gets. The creators of the film Source Code approached time travel in an interesting way, as the protagonist has the ability to enter the body of a man 8 minutes before his death in a train bombing, and he does this multiple times, each time discovering another clue that leads to uncovering the perpetrator of the attack. In a similar way, the mimics, aliens hostile to humans, operate in the film Edge of Tomorrow, which by the way was based on the novel by Hiroshi Sakurazaka, All You Need Is Kill. Humanity falls victim to an invasion from space. The opponents turn out to have the ability to manipulate time, and the hero returns after death with the battle in which he died happening again. Another interesting film is the now cult classic Primer, which shows how easily one can get tangled in different versions of the timeline while trying to restore it to its original course. Glory to anyone who can figure out what the original timeline is in this production. There is even a website where enthusiasts try to unravel the temporal complications. And now, I'll mention the most interesting position in my opinion, showing the cool paradox. I'm talking about Robert Heinlein's short story, All You Zombies, and the film and its movie adaptation, Predestination, in which the protagonist turns out to be, well, I've already made that mistake once, and solved the biggest twist in the history of time travel, so this time I will not do that to you. You have to read it or watch it yourself. Since, based on cultural works, we already know that interference with the past can carry the risk of catastrophic consequences and create paradoxes, but yet the laws of physics do not prohibit time travel, we can assume that it is possible. But what to do with those pesky paradoxes? One possible solution is the existence of an unknown law of physics that prevents any change. Whatever we do in the past inevitably leads to the outcome we already know well. However, most physicists agree that the existence of such a law is highly unlikely, and some of them propose an alternative solution. Well, every decision we make could lead to a split and the creation of another timeline. According to this hypothesis, there is a version of reality in which we took our lottery ticket out of the pocket, we are now millionaires, instead of having scrambled eggs for breakfast, we had a sandwich, and instead of taking the bus to work or school, we walked. This inevitably leads to the creation of an infinite number of separate timelines, and thus entire universes differing from each other as a result of the decision we made. If we add randomness to this, they can differ even by the number of grains of sand on a beach and can arise during every event in the entire universe, including different trajectories of atoms and particles colliding with each other. Again, many scientists approach this hypothesis with skepticism, and so far we have no way to test it experimentally. However, let's assume that we found a solution to all temporal paradoxes. We want to build our time machine and embark on a journey. So how do we do it? There are several ways to travel right now. One of them is theoretically within our reach. This refers to body freezing, called otherwise cryonics. This method was first applied in 1967 when, thanks to the Life Extension Society and technology developed by Ivan Cooper, a human body was frozen. It was James Hiram Bedford who was suffering from kidney cancer, and his body is stored now at the headquarters of the cryopreservation company called Alcor. So far, only the wealthy and terminally ill people use this method, hoping that in the future we will find a cure for their illness. It is worth mentioning that there are few problems associated with this technology. As of today, we are unable to safely freeze a human body without risking its damage. The first problem is ice crystals forming from the water and bursting the cells. That can be dealt with by using cryoprotectants, substances that replace water in the body. Unfortunately, this is associated with another problem, namely, they are toxic to us, and although biologists claim that the adverse changes can be reversed in the future, we still do not know how to do it. Next option is traveling at speed close to the speed of light. In this case, time dilation is on our side, and the twin paradox come to our aid. We already have the technology for constant, although slow, acceleration of a vehicle in space. Theoretically, we could do it to a speed close enough to speed of light that onboard time would pass significantly slower than time outside the vehicle. So, upon returning, we would appear on Earth in its future. Unfortunately, both of the above methods only offer a one-way trip, and we still want to retrieve our lotto ticket, prevent an accident, or avoid the breakup. So, we are left with only two options, though for engineering reasons they are still purely theoretical. First of them is the Tipler cylinder. Frank Tipler, an American physicist and mathematician, presented the concept of an infinitely long cylinder running through the universe constructed from superdense matter, which by rotating around its axis would enable backward time travel. This effect is achieved through the gravitational interaction of mass distorting spacetime. Unfortunately, the concept of an object of infinite length creates an infinitely great problem with its realization. So, although mathematics proves that the existence of such an object is possible, in practice it remains in the realm of dreams. The other way to travel is spacetime tunnel. It is a hypothetical structure formed by a particular bending of spacetime in such a way that it creates a tunnel connecting distant regions of the universe. But you all already know that. The trick is, one would need to accelerate the exit of such a tunnel to an immense speed and then pull it back. Thanks to time dilation, the entrance to the tunnel would be older than the exit, so we could theoretically travel back in time this way, although only to the moment where our spacetime tunnel was created. So what now with our unfortunately lost lotto ticket? If you think about it, perhaps the fact that we lost it is precisely the greatest win that the fate has bestowed upon us. As the adventures of the protagonists in novels and the films about time travel show us, it could turn out that on the way to the lottery office with our winning ticket, we could have been run over by a car or fall a victim to some other tragedy. Or maybe that's exactly what happened, and we ourselves from the future visited our home and slipped that piece of paper into our trousers pocket to avoid an accident? We don't know that, but one thing is for sure. We are all traveling through time right now, second by second, heading towards the future. And where can we find quick travel in both directions? In our favorite science fiction. That's all for today, my friends. Thank you for watching. Read good science fiction and see you in the next video.